Welcome to video 2 in a series on outcome mapping. This video I wanted to just talk about the difference between the logical framework approach and outcome mapping. I don't think that they conflict with each other. I think they're quite complementary to each other. And personally I have liked and enjoyed the logical framework as part of my work. It introduced and forced me to think logically about what I was trying to achieve when I first met it some 20 years ago. Its origins are, I believe, in the US military and then picked up by USAID, and certainly DFID has been using it strongly for the last 10 years. The logical framework was trying to do two things, in my opinion. These are just my opinions. This is a great thing about video as the new medium. Without having to put stuff in writing, it doesn't look like you're trying to be authoritative about anything. In my opinion, the logical framework is trying to do two things. One was to force people to think about their program and to actually try to explain the logic behind their program. But the second thing was as an administrative tool. It was to try and get those 60 pages of narrative down to 1 or 2 pages. Now I have seen logical frameworks that are 20, 25 pages, and I think that kind of makes a nonsense of the whole thing. But the idea was that you had a very succinct summary of what you were trying to do, so the poor old administrator who had to wade through 70, 80, 90 proposals could just very quickly look at the one-page logical framework and decide yay or nay, or this goes through to the next round, now I'll read the narrative for it. So it was a first cut administrative tool. Now everybody talks about it as a living document. You're supposed to revise your logical frameworks. Yes, all of that is true in theory, and we all know that in practice very few people do revisit their logical frameworks, and very few people revise them as the program develops. So it was to get us to think about the logic in our program. It created the goal. What was our longer term aim beyond the project lifetime? What were we actually looking for? Our purpose or objective for the actual program. And then what outputs, what completed tasks were we going to do that would lead to that purpose and our activities, and what inputs will we need to do those activities. That's all straightforward, but it's a very large step between each of those things. So doing these outputs or completing these outputs, how does that lead us to the purpose? Yeah, we had the assumptions box, which often many people didn't write in, but the question was how, was around the how. How did, so for instance, if I pick up on my rural water supply example from video 1, installation of 20 hand pumps, that's our output. Our purpose is to provide 20,000 people with access to clean water. And in fact our goal may have been to reduce the morbidity and mortality even of children among those 20,000 people. But how does the installation of a hand pump actually lead to access to clean water? It's not a straightforward thing. We know of so many cases where hand pumps have been installed, where the program has been an infrastructure program, so it focused on just installing the hand pumps, but it made no provision for long-term maintenance, long-term service delivery. It didn't have a service delivery approach. It didn't even, in the early days, back in the late 80s, we were installing hand pumps without engaging the community. We were turning up and saying, right, here's a nice hand pump, going away again, and them saying, oh well, we better not touch it because it belongs to the government, or it belongs to this agency. Okay, nowadays we tend to engage with the community. We have discussions with them, we make sure there's community ownership, we make sure there's some provision for community maintenance. But those complexities are not there in the log frame. In the log frame we tend to put install 20 hand pumps, and in the purpose we say 20,000 people will have access to clean water. What we need to do is sometimes unpack what those complexities are, what those nuances are, and that's where outcome mapping really kicks in. Because outcome mapping would look at this through a completely different lens. It looks at the people involved and asks what behaviour change are we looking for in those people, and therefore what will be the outcome. So when we're looking at even the water engineers, we're looking at how will they interact with the community. What behaviour change do we want? Do we want them to just go in and do their job of installing a physical piece of kit? Or do we want them to be able to engage with the community and show them how that kit is installed as they are installing it? The community themselves might be a boundary partner to us, and we might have an extension worker who's going to facilitate the dialogue about ownership. Well, we want some behaviour change in our staff member, the facilitator. We want him or her to be able to engage with people, to approach them, to spend enough time with them. But we also want some behaviour change from the community. We want to see that ownership. We want them to see, to gain the knowledge that they're going to have to maintain this this rural water supply, to have an attitude towards, yes, we will maintain this supply, and to actually move forward in setting up systems and structures amongst their community in order to be able to raise the funds to service the rural water supply. Now, I know that rural water supplies are perhaps one of the simplest development interventions there are. What happens when we start talking about solving corruption among a police force, or intervening in a fragile state where there's civil war and there are refugees, whatever? People are at the key of things, and this is where outcome mapping comes in. Outcome mapping, although it talks a lot about contribution, not attribution, and it actually steers away from true causality, this, we have installed rural water supplies, therefore 20,000 people have access to clean water, therefore child health has improved. Actually, we can say the presence of rural water supplies contributes to access to clean water, which contributes to the improvement in child health. But although outcome mapping steers away from causality per se and talks all the time about contribution, the thing it does do over and above the logical framework is it does force us to discuss causality. We are actually saying, right, if we want the behaviour change of the people to be that they take up ownership of this rural water supply, if our boundary partners of the community are going to own the rural water supply, what must we do to stimulate that ownership? Now, again, outcome mapping is great in that it talks about separating out things that you can control, things that you can influence, and it acknowledges that we can't control people's behaviour. We can influence their behaviour change, but we can't control it. But what it has done is it's prompted us to say, well, what activities, what interventions should we do that might influence and prompt that behaviour change, that might cause that behaviour change. So outcome mapping actually draws us towards details that the logical framework doesn't. We have a results chain in the logical framework, and we have a fairly linear view of the world as well. The other element of outcome mapping is that it's all the time helping us to adapt, So again, the logical framework is supposedly a living document, but in practice it often gets solidified after funding. Outcome mapping, on the other hand, is constantly encouraging us through our journaling to look at where we are now and what needs to be done in the next 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, to make sure that we remain on track for where we're actually intending to go. And linearness. Again, logical frameworks do actually have a box for unexpected outcomes, but very few people enter items into that box. Again, outcome mapping is all about a landscape. It's a map. That's what I love about the term. It's a map, not a pathway. We're not saying we're going to do this and that will be the result. Actually, we're saying we're heading in that direction, and these are some of the markers that we might expect to see on that landscape. We'll come to that when we talk about progress markers. So one of the key differences between outcome mapping and the logical framework is its focus on behavior change. It's drawing us into some of the details. It is much more of a living document or a living process than the logical framework, although the logical framework is intended to be. And it helps us form and adapt to complex situations so that we can see actual people, real people, what are their behaviors and what do we need to do to adapt to the changing context or changing circumstances. In a logical framework, you could assume that, you know, we were going in and putting in 20 rural water supplies hand pumps. But what happens then if we just get one district governor who doesn't agree with the program? Now, true, in the logical framework, you put that in the assumptions that all district governors are going to encourage and agree with the national program of rural water supply installation. But few of us do, let's be honest. And what outcome mapping does is that actually the district governor becomes a boundary partner. Maybe we suddenly discover he's an obstruction to our program of work, and so we adopt him as a boundary partner, and then we work out, okay, what should we as a program be doing to facilitate change in him? Okay, I hope that is a rapid and slightly messy but helpful contrast between the logical framework approach and outcome mapping. In the next video, we'll move on to the actual outcome mapping steps as suggested by IDRC.